Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Jenny, and what a great story you told about that taxi driver, because it links very well to my talk. So this is my disclaimer. I'm talking about marine reserves partially because I'm quite passionate about them, because I've seen the benefits of marine reserves. I've been engrossed in the marine environment for over 30 years now. I don't fish. I find it quite boring. I do buy fish, I do eat fish, but I don't eat fish. I just want to let you know that I've sort of got no vested interest in sort of in marine reserves or going fishing, making sure they provide enough fish for going fishing. But I am passionate about the marine environment. One thing I have been very fortunate to do, as Jenny said, I've been to many islands in the Pacific. I've never tried to count them, but it'd be over 70 at least. And I've seen a whole range of impacts on these islands, whether they're local impacts or they could be climatic or major physical impacts like big storms, and also impacts of overfishing. So I've been very fortunate to see that and get a perspective that not many people have the opportunity to do, because I can actually see comparisons. Similarly, I've been involved in a lot of research around how seascapes have changed over time. We did an exhibition here some years ago and we documented how snapper sizes have reduced over the last 50 years and the biomass has reduced over the last 50 years and all that sort of thing. So these are stories that I know a lot of you have already heard, so I won't labour those. One place I have been very fortunate to be to several times is Rangitahua Kermadec Islands, which is New Zealand's biggest marine reserve. And there's a proposal to turn it into one of the third largest marine reserve in the world as well. What Rangitahua does demonstrate is that what we see around the coast of New Zealand, and in fact most coasts in the world, is anything but pristine or natural. What we're seeing is a highly modified environment, and this distresses me because I know the consequence of that is lower resistance, biodiversity losses and biomass losses for the things that people think about, which is how many fish they can catch. So to put Rangitahua into sort of some perspective, there's been a big survey by a guy called Graham Edgar from Tasmania who surveyed hundreds of reefs around the world and looked and measured and basically gave an assessment of how pristine these areas were based on how isolated it was, how enforced the marine protection was, that it was a no-take reserve, that it was an old reserve and it was relatively large. These are all factors that give the characteristics of a relatively untouched environment in that the impacts of humans is not very detectable or not very obvious. There are only, I'm glad you're all sitting down, there are only 4 islands in the world that meet all 5 of these criteria, which is quite shocking actually. And Rangitahua, if you look on the left-hand side of the image there, is number 2. There's 2 in the just off the west coast of the isthmus, the American isthmus, and then one in the Coral Sea, and that is it. Every other place demonstrates impacts by people, which to me is telling you something about the impact people are having overall. I was going to put an animation in here about how maximum sustainable yield has been exceeded in every part of the oceans around the world, but again, you probably know that. Marine reserves aren't a new concept. They're over 100 years old. This is a very famous fisheries scientist who basically thought that one way of capturing, of isolating human impacts on a particular area is to actually lock up an area from fishing. But he also realised the political consequences of that was very difficult. And actually the people would actually object, or fishers would actually object, and it would take a strong level of enforcement to actually make them work. So it's not a new concept. It's just taken a long time to get there to actually establish marine reserves, and in New Zealand it's only been going for 40 years. The tragedy of the commons is something you've probably all heard, and the issue is that there's a resource that can replenish itself, but it's a limited resource, and the impacts of lots of small removals out of that limited resource amount to a large loss, and in fact to such an extent that it often can't recover on its own. And that's why we need mechanisms to try to get them going. Marine systems are actually quite amazing. Because their larvae and their eggs are the dispersal phase, and Craig's going to talk about this a little bit about how they do this, is they can actually repopulate areas that have been depleted. So marine systems are actually really good, as long as there is a healthy population somewhere else to restock it. It's all to do with dispersal of the larvae. The problem is, if you deplete one little seamount or little island or something, you get larvae coming from another place to repopulate it, which is a great mechanism. So if you just leave it alone, it will come back to what it was, as long as you don't stuff up the environment that it's on. The other problem is, what if there's no upstream source of larvae? Then it cannot be recolonised, and you're relying only on the larvae that are on that reef to repopulate it, and that's possible as well. And in fact, it seems to happen a lot more than we ever thought. But there's some challenges in how you design a marine reserve network to make sure that this can happen. There's some challenges with the legislation because we're existing under Marine Reserve Act, which really only permits establishment of a marine reserve for scientific purposes and only out to the 12 nautical mile zone. It's quite an old act. It requires the co-signatory of the Minister for Fisheries, or MPI at this stage, and the Minister for Conservation, and very rarely do the two combine. And it took Bill, who sort of really pushed for a marine reserve network at Goat Island, Marine Reserve at Goat Island, New Zealand's first marine reserve. It took him over 12 years to get through the hurdles of government, and it required a lot of public support. And it was one of the most frustrating journeys he'd ever had. Since 2002, so we're approaching 20 years of this, there's been a Marine Reserves Bill which has been tabled, which is actually a lot better system, and every government that's been in since then has said, yes, we will address this Marine Reserves Bill. We actually have signed up to a commitment, a United Nations commitment, to establish 10% of our EEZ as a marine reserve network. But the problem is, no government has seen it as a major priority, so they haven't done it. So this is what our marine reserve network looks like. It's actually pretty puny. All those red dots, there's 34 altogether, all those red dots around the coast are generally very small. It's not really a functioning marine reserve network in terms of being able to repopulate impacted areas. The largest marine reserves are the ones that are politically less risky. The big islands offshore, Rangitahua, Kermadec Islands, the Auckland Islands, and other subantarctic islands. Coastally, it's almost impossible to do, and the lens that we use to develop these marine reserves is actually our human lens. We actually usually designate areas that we like the look of, and we often use places that we use for recreation. Some exceptions, Fiordland Marine Reserve, MPA, Marine Protected Area, is actually a very large area on the coast. Well, it's remote, very few people can get there. So you can see the challenges of establishing a marine reserve network, because you get the marine reserve deniers coming in and being a loud voice and challenging government, and that stalls progress on developing marine reserves. For those of you from Aotea, you recall some years ago, so I arrived in 2007, and this was ongoing when I arrived, and I was and it sort of was an eye-opener for me about how difficult it is to get marine protection. This had huge community support, iwi support, fisher support, and it just failed because the Minister of Fisheries wouldn't sign the legislation to establish a marine reserve. So we're still stuck with no marine reserve around Aotea. So here was the big hope. I participated in the initial stages of this and was one of the scientific advisors or advisors for the sea change process. It sounded really good. Everyone got involved. It was a collaborative process. Everyone was asked to leave their sector interests behind. Didn't that sound great? Meanwhile, while they're establishing the group that were actually developing the sea change process, there was all this lobbying in the background, making sure that the commercial fishers had enough representation on it. And I actually felt quite, well, here we go. People are asked to leave their sector interests behind, but still there's lobbying in the background to make sure that their interests are actually represented. It was a big opportunity, but it was, in my mind, it's actually been a failed opportunity. What they've come up with is a proposal for a marine reserve network of sorts in the Hauraki Gulf, but again, it was basically a deal done not looking at the environment, what habitats need to be protected, what areas would benefit most from marine protection. It was actually a deal where the recreational fishers said, yeah, we'll give you that, we can live without that, we'll give you that, we can live without that. but actually it doesn't establish a very effective marine reserve network. It's better than nothing, but it's actually would be better if it was actually planned well, using the best evidence we have at the moment. I'll very briefly touch on the benefits of marine reserves. So marine reserves often have very distinct boundaries, and change can appear very quickly, usually in the scale of 5 to 10 years, where you see species that have been depleted in marine reserves bouncing up very quickly. And the benefits of marine reserves are known by fishers, because this map you see here is the dark blue areas of the marine reserve area, and every black dot or every dot there is an attempt to catch fish. The coloured dots are where they've caught more fish, and this is called fishing the line, where they know that the reserve is working so effectively that the fish are moving out of the reserve, and as they're moving out, the best place to catch them, of course, is just outside the gate. There's a couple of cheeky ones that go inside the reserve. Hopefully they got busted. Goat Island or the Goat Island Marine Reserve that you know also showed very similar sort of change over a period of 5 to 10 years, where the numbers spiked for crayfish and for rock lobster and for snapper, increased by 9 to 15 times in biomass and numbers within the reserve, which is quite an amazing result. I'll touch on some of that a bit later on. And it's all to do with that increasing density inside the reserve and the larger that the fish can get as well. However, last year a report came out which tended to indicate that the Goat Island Reserve failed. So I'll just try to talk you through this. Crop is Goat Island, the Marine Reserve. It's more commonly known as that. And in 1995, after a period of time after the reserve was established, you can see that red dot on about 40. That was sort of the abundance of rock lobster in the marine reserve. Huge, much higher than in the non-reserve area, which is the grey dot at about 10. So it's about 4 times the lobster abundance inside the reserve compared to outside the reserve. So that outside reserve area is roughly what it was like before the marine reserve was established. So come to 2016, 2017, and the number of lobster inside the reserve is actually less than it was outside the reserve before 20 years earlier in 1995. So it seemed to suggest that actually lobster numbers were going down inside the reserve. And what it indicates, it doesn't mean that the marine reserves failed, the design of it's failed. What it means is the lobster, the pressure outside of the reserve is now so great, and lobsters migrate, as most fish do. As soon as they step over the line outside the reserve, they get caught. So the pressure is so great outside the reserve that there's no opportunity for the lobster to actually build up in numbers inside the reserve, because as soon as they step out, there's pots all over the place or divers collecting them, that there's no chance for lobster to actually build up in numbers. What that tells me is that reserve is too small, and there needs to be stricter controls on what happens and how much pressure is outside in the Hauraki Gulf. The Hauraki Gulf is an area under extreme stress, pressure, from a whole range of reasons, whether it's sedimentation, fishing pressure, any other extractive uses, and everyone wants a slice of the action. And this is an indicator that we really have gone too far. We're not even within a reserve, any species that move outside of the reserve are safe. So there have been proposals to exclude some activities in the Hauraki Gulf. Commercial fishing is one that I've heard over the years. And that is a part solution, and it will take some of the pressure off, but all that's doing is releasing more of the fish availability for the recreational fishers, which is the end game for that sector interest. And it might work for a little while, but all that's going to happen in a wealthy area with a high boat usage, boat ownership level, around Auckland, is the pressure is not going to diminish. Those fish will still be under extreme pressure, so there needs to be some change in the way we manage the fish stocks in areas like the Hauraki Gulf. There's an example from the Gippsland Lakes, which is a much larger area to this in eastern Victoria, where there's pressure now by the recreational fishers to get the commercial fisheries out of the Gippsland Lakes. They've cut their fleet size over the last 20 years by a quarter. I think there's only 10 boats left in the Gippsland Lakes. And they mostly catch a snapper relative, which is the main commercial catch, which is what they catch to sell to the public, so people like me that don't go fishing. The recreational fishers want them out, even though the recreational fishers now catch 80% of the catch. They still think the commercial guys are having too much of an impact on the fishery. It's that cumulative effect of many people that has a bigger impact than the commercial sector. And in the Gulf, the recreational catch, there's no really good measures of it, but the recreational catch almost certainly exceeds the commercial catch of most fish species of commercial interest. The other ridiculous thing is that the allowable catch by recreational fishers, 20 fish you can go home with at the end of the day per person. Now, it's a mixed species catch. There are limits on some species, how many you can take, but 20. That's not going fishing. That's actually, that's a major harvest. It's on the verge of it's a commercial enterprise. And I'd looked this up today and I was actually quite horrified how much the fines were. If you're seen to be catching twice the limit that you're allowed, so going home with 60 fish per person, it's only a $500 fine. There's not much incentive for you not to overfish, let alone fishing undersized fish and all that sort of stuff as well. So there's some issues we need to deal with in the Gulf. I don't have all the answers, but I'm suggesting that some of the scientific evidence that we can present can help develop some of the answers and some of the plans and how we might go ahead and do it. Now, being Australian, this is probably the most famous marine protected area in the world. In the 1990s, there was only less than 10% that was set aside as no-take marine reserves within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And then a very courageous, conservative former minister led the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, got the best available evidence and challenged the community and said, we're going to aim for 33% marine protected area. You can just imagine the outcry. The sky was going to fall in, the fish stocks were going to collapse. There was just going to be, the fishes were all going to go bust, etc., etc. None of that eventuated. In fact, it is one of the most resilient systems. Now, global warming is having a big impact, but the only reason it's going to survive in some form, things will change, is because it's a resilient system that's very well protected. So the community support was overwhelming, the commercial interests were deniers, but the result has been fantastic. There has been no loss of fisheries production in that time. There's been a boost in tourism opportunities within the network. So actually the income that's been able to be generated from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is actually much greater than it was when it was just a commercial interest area. So I won't labour this too much, but basically there was a great experiment that was done. The challenge is, okay, I've shown you around the sort of what happens around the fringes of a marine reserve, but it's very difficult to demonstrate the impacts of a marine reserve or no-take area on areas outside of the reserve and how it actually boosts productivity outside of the reserve. So there's a very neat experiment done here. The green areas are marine reserve areas. So what these guys did is genetically marked, oh yeah, how much have I got, 5? Okay, all right. I started late, but basically what they demonstrated, I won't go into the details of it, but they genetically mark individuals and then go back later and see how many of the ones that had actually spawned generated new young. What they showed was that the source of about half of the juveniles in the whole area actually came from inside the reserve, even though reserve only made up about a quarter of the area. So the marine reserve individuals inside the marine reserve produce almost twice as many successful juveniles in the region than the areas outside of the reserve. It's to do with fish health and the amount of productivity they can give. There was some neat modelling done that demonstrates that 33% is a sweet spot in terms of reducing the impacts of heavy fishing and overfishing, and also to make it a resilient system from climatic events like cyclones and tsunamis and things like that, and even climate change, sea temperature change. So it seems like 30 to 33% is the sweet spot. So what would that look like here? Huge. It'd change the place hugely, and it would actually be a great opportunity for the Hauraki Gulf to take the challenge on. There are some rules around developing marine reserves. I've listed those up there. I won't go into those, but it's about how representative of habitats it is, how big it is, and how connected they all are together. I've given you a bit of background on all of that. but it needs to be driven by everyone realising the benefits of it. So I'm just going to finish up with, I went to a talk by Daniel Hikuroa at Auckland Uni a couple of weeks ago, and for me it was sort of like one of those shifting thinking, and I'm hoping I can sort of get you there the way that Dan got me there. But there's a Polynesian concept of Moana. Moana Nui Akiwa is the Pacific Ocean, that big open ocean, but and caring for the ocean, and Hine Moana is the personification of the ocean, and it represents the ocean in a human sort of character. And it's a really nice concept that we can actually think of Hine Moana, there it is, I'll let you read that, as sort of a being, and we've already done that through legislation in the Uruwetas and the Whanganui River. So there's an opportunity here to think of the Hauraki Gulf, or actually possibly all of our oceans, as a living being, that we actually leave our sectorial interests behind, and we actually think, okay, how can we benefit this whole being, rather than thinking, what am I going to lose if we set aside a marine reserve? My favourite fishing spot's no longer going to be available. So my take-home points: you've got to care for the whole system, not just a patch of it. Get rid of your individual interests, because the benefits of doing it properly actually benefit individuals as well as the whole Gulf as well. Thank you.